On November the 25th, 3 Ukrainian boats were intercepted and seized by the Russian Navy en route to the Sea of Azov through the Kerch Strait. 24 sailors were detained, and both sides are blaming the other for unlawful provocation. What's likely to happen if the Ukrainian sailors are prosecuted? Is this the most dangerous clash since 2014, once again pushing the two sides closer to open warfare? And how does this incident fit into and affect larger geopolitical competition? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, and Harvey Zordin, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. We shall also speak via satellite to security analyst Pavel Fagenhor in Moscow. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. What's the latest about the crisis? Do you think it's going to escalate into an open warfare?
No, I don't think so. The probability of a war is pretty low, simply because Russia now that they occupy the advantage position, they want to control the situation rather than out of the control towards the war. Now Russia obviously take strength, and they can control war or peace. And as long as Moscow doesn't want to go to war, I don't think the current incident will escalate it onto all. On the other hand, NATO is very cautious, although the Ukraine has repeatedly called for NATO's involvement. NATO and the U.S., especially U.S., remain keeping the position, say, solve the issue through dialogues and negotiation. No intention, no indication for sending the forces that Ukraine really want.
What do you think of the poor cousin of Ukraine for the NATO?
I think Ukraine is kind of just hanging out there. They really don't have any power. They don't have any weapons. I think they're in a very, very bad situation. So if the Russians wanted to do more provocation, there's not much countervailing force. I do think the Americans, in some ways more than NATO, may do something. I think a lot of it depends on domestic situation. Putin's ratings have gone down. Trump's in trouble with the special counsel, and so a lot of it could determine on whether or not each is in trouble, because the best way to divert attention is just to start a little war.
Pavel, let me go to our Russian panelist who's standing by in Moscow for his insightful analysis about the crisis. Pavel, do you think the crisis is over?
No, the crisis is obviously not over. The situation is rather dangerous. It's not, of course, that the war is imminent or an escalation is imminent, but the probability is not zero. The West, the Americans and the Germans are rather frightened by this situation, especially the Germans, and putting in a lot of effort to de-escalate. And the Pentagon has drastically increased its intel gathering efforts in the region, and their long-range drones and manned recon intelligence gathering planes are flying bigger missions close to Crimea and outside, actually, of the Donbass, where they were doing that on a regular basis, flying closer to Russian borders to observe what's actually happening on the ground. So this is a kind of situation that is fluid and could go in any direction. Both sides are blaming, of course, each other for possibly taking the initiative, but an escalation is possible and it won't dissipate on its own. A lot of effort should be put in by the international community and by the participants to avoid a head-on collision, or at least a serious escalation of the fighting.
Given the apparent reluctance of the NATO and the weakness of the Ukrainian military, do you think Kiev will be the first to blink in the standoff? Pavel?
Well, the Ukrainians, of course, yes, the Ukrainians are not actually, of course, thinking about the real offensive. They tried it in 2014 when they believed that they could crush the separatists in the Donbass, believing Russia could not intervene really. They ran into Russian serious counter blow and are not seeking any kind of offensive anytime soon. Their military today is, of course, better organized than in 2014. Though it's still a very backward Soviet-style military with a lot of Soviet hardware. They bought something abroad, like they have the American anti-tank, very modern Javelin missile, but in the rest they are a rather backward force. Russia is much more modern and better organized and bigger, and of course it would always have the upper hand. But Russia is also reluctant to get directly involved in any kind of internal Ukrainian civil war type of fighting, though Russia would of course want to see Ukraine turn its strategic direction into moving towards NATO and the European Union and return to the fold, to the kind of pro-Russian, post-Soviet organization and become a true Russian ally.
If you look at the history, Xi Yu, the two countries have been interwoven so closely.
Yep.
Now and then, Ukraine was part of Russia. The Russian Federation was so strong in history. Now, what do you think of the symbolic implications of terminating the Russia-Ukraine Friendship Treaty?
Well, I think, yes, you're right. It's a symbolic meaning more than substantive meaning. However, in terms of substantive meaning, the end of the treaty indicates the possible door to resume the friendship with Russia is closed completely. And such ending treaty action will escalate more and more efforts by Ukraine to integrate into EU and NATO rather than to keep the existing relatively independent status quo, say middle ground between the West and Russia. Now the action of ending the treaty means Ukraine will speed up the efforts towards the West and based on the anti-Russian sentiments.
The appeal for independence in Donbass and the other twin sister province started right after the Russian seizure of Crimea in 2014.
Yep.
Now, geopolitically, how important is the Kerch Strait for Russians?
Well, you mentioned the geopolitical. That is a key factor for this root of the incidents. Many people speculated that the incidents was triggered by Ukraine president who wanted to make use of the incident to fan up his advantages in the upcoming presidential election. That's not the true reason. The true reason is, as you mentioned, the two eastern regions in Ukraine that are seeking for independence from Ukraine to Russia, and the Kerch Strait occupies a very vital position, like a door for the two regions' lifeline.
It's a gateway to the two regions which call for independence.
That is the single gateway towards the sea. Without the Kerch freedom passage, the port cities, several port cities, will be meaningless.
So, in other words, it's an operation for freedom of navigation.
Yeah.
One side's navigation.
What's your take about this operation?
I think the Russians have been planning for this for a long time. They've trolled about this since 2015 and talked about these crazy scenarios. They violated international law, because Article 30 of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea says that warships should be granted sovereign immunity and allowed to either pass through these kinds of waters, or the most the Russians could have done is tell them to get their ship out of there, not to seize it and not to seize the soldiers. So I think the Russians are playing hardball. They're trying to set up a situation where they may do more. And I think back to the Cold War, and there were two expressions that I think of in this situation. And one of them was, we always said that the Russians had a saying, what's mine is mine and what yours is negotiable. And the other saying they had was about the salami war. So they cut off little pieces, little pieces, little pieces, until after a while, like the Beatles song says, back in the USSR. So I worry about the Russians a lot.
Very interesting joke. Back to Pavel. What's going to happen should the 24 sailors be detained and put on trial?
Well, they have the 24 Ukrainian servicemen have been moved from Crimea to Moscow to the FSB Lefortovo prison. They are being interrogated and most likely could go on trial. At least the Russian President Vladimir Putin said in Buenos Aires, where he was for the G20, that everything should be documented about this provocation. So the Russian interrogators will be seeking some kind of confessions that this was a conspiracy. And of course, for Moscow, this is a conspiracy that's not so much Ukrainian, but it's America and the European Union, because Russia is kind of facing them by proxy, and the Ukrainians are just kind of puppets of these outside powers that are fueling this conflict. That's how it's been seen and said by the Russian authorities. So it's not just about the control of the Straits of Kerch, which of course, again, Russia officially says is their internal waters, and that international law of the open sea does not apply, again, which is actually challenged by the West, by the Europeans and by the Americans. So this is kind of seen as part of a kind of classical Cold War style proxy confrontation. And for Russia, the most important thing is not so much even Ukraine, but Ukraine going west and Western military installations appearing in Ukraine on the Sea of Azov and in other places deep inside what Russia sees as its own internal territory and internal waters. And that is something Moscow is going to be opposed with everything it takes to not allow the West to move in so deep into what Russia considers its backyard.
Militarily,
so these
excuse me, Pavel, militaries aside, excuse me, Pavel, let's put the issue of military strength aside. Politically, who will be the winner for the standoff? You look at what happened in the early 1980s when Falkland Islands or Malvinas Islands were occupied by troops of Argentina, and late Prime Minister Thatcher sent troops there, and we had the warfare. It was taken back, of course, by the British troops, and politically, Lady Thatcher averted a crisis of no confidence, and she took the upper hand in the dogfight in the parliament. Let's look at Moscow. The approval rating for President Putin dropped from over 70 to 50% this year. Do you think politically intercepting the two Ukrainian boats would help show up the support for your president in Moscow?
That could be a consideration, but I don't believe that it is the main one. President Putin got re-elected for 6 more years just less than a year ago, and so he's not facing any kind of elections anytime soon, and he's in no need right now to whip up support. He could have done that using other means, not just simply military means. I mean, right now they're performing some very unpopular social reforms, like with the increasing the pension age, and that could have been avoided, and his ratings would have been, again, sky high, and they basically have the money in the budget not to do that. So that was a calculated move. For Ukraine, it's different. They have parliamentary and presidential elections coming up. And for Ukrainian politicians right now to play kind of patriot apparently seems to be a good way to get a better rating and win those very important elections. For President Poroshenko to possibly try to get reelected, or for those who oppose him to get elected instead. So in Ukraine, that is more of an internal kind of political thing than it is right now in Russia. Russia sees it, and Moscow, I believe, and Kremlin sees it as primarily a geopolitical standoff, not something that is dictated by internal politics.
Pavel, Harvey wants to respond to your comments.
Yeah, Pavel, I think that with due respect, I agree with you about the fact that Putin doesn't have a re-election for 5 years or so. But on the other hand, as you just mentioned, he has some internal problems to deal with. And he needs to deal with those problems or put people's attention elsewhere. And the best way to divert attention, like I said before, is to start a little war. And I think this could be part of the strategy.
Pavel?
Well, I say maybe that is, to some extent, I can't say it's not, part of the considerations. But I would believe that geopolitics and the standoff with the West and the internal squabble within the Russian government and administration between the liberal economic bloc that wants to cut defense spending and the military, the diplomats and others, intelligence services, who want to keep high defense spending. And so will promote confrontations with the West or with Ukraine, or in general keep the tension high. So that's maybe more of an important thing internally than trying to kind of win over the Russian populace. The Russian populace is basically backing Putin anyway. There is no right now real threat internally to the Russian regime whatsoever. So I would not believe that they would risk any kind of confrontation just to keep the population kind of beat up on the jingoism beat.
Thank you so much. Let's look at how Germans responded to the crisis. The outgoing Angela Merkel, I mean, she's not really outgoing at this moment. She has a few years to be the prime minister. Having said this, what do you think of the practical foreign policy that characterizes her administration, especially towards Russia after the seizure of Crimea?
Well, I think Germany under Merkel has conducted a very unique policy from the other NATO members towards Russia, especially the case of Ukraine-Russian contradictions, because of two reasons. One reason is Germany has got long-time economic ties, closer ties than many other...
Especially in times of the winter.
Yeah. Anyway, energy. And the market.
Energy, and to be energized.
Yeah, and the other reason is the potential double-edged sword of the security. If you have a good relation with Russia, you will enjoy security. If not, insecurity. So because of the security and the economic reasons, Germany has to conduct their own relatively independent policy towards Russia, regardless of what Russia will and have done. So under the current situation, German government really choose a pragmatical way to choose, calling for political solution rather than military. That really reflects the typical tactics by Macron.
Well, what do you think of the fact of the winter? That reminds me of what happened in 1812. Peter Tchaikovsky wrote a very good piece of music about defeating Napoleon Bonaparte at the height of the winter. And to use a very bad comparison, Adolf Hitler also suffered a lot during the winter in the Second World War. I'm not talking about one ring that is missing from the 5-ring Olympic Games in Sochi, the opening ceremony. But the winter does, count for the triumph and success of Russia if you look at history. This time around, what do you think of energy supply for Germans?
Well, you've got this deal about this pipeline, this dual gas pipeline that goes from the Russian border to Germany called Nord Stream 2. And Mrs. Merkel and her successor in the party leadership, Christian Democratic leadership, have both said that what's going on in Ukraine and Nord Stream 2 are two different things. Mrs. Merkel got a pledge from Mr. Putin that he wouldn't cut off the supplies of gas, but frankly, I don't trust him. So I think they're playing a dangerous game. Russia really needs the income from this gas, and I'm worried that the salami war is going to continue and more pieces are going to be cut off. I think this is the time to take that knife away and stop the slicing of the salami. I think the Germans are in a position, and the EU is in a position to put their foot down and to stop this.
Why do you think the NATO has displayed apparent indifference, or why do you think NATO has given a cold shoulder to Kiev about their demand to be part of NATO, to be the next round of NATO's eastward expansion?
Well, I think that Ukraine's not a member of NATO. Had it become a member of NATO, the picture would be far different.
You mean there would be a third world war?
There would be something.
It's
not all or nothing. But there might be a bigger confrontation, not a third world war necessarily. But I think that NATO, because Ukraine's not a member, is not willing to go to bat for them. And I think this is part of the problem. They'll make nice noises. Maybe they'll do some things that'll push back a little bit. But when push comes to shove, no, they're not going to go in there.
So do you think Ukraine has actually become the haunting specter above continental Europe?
Well, I think Ukraine now is at a historical crossroad. Politically, sooner or later, Ukraine has to make a choice between the western part and the Russian part. And probably they will go to...
is it likely that Ukraine will fall apart?
Very
possible.
Yeah, possible, simply because the eastern part is more fragile than before, especially when Crimea has been annexed by Russia, and the Kerch and the Sea of Azov have been controlled totally under Russia. And unfortunately, the lifeline by sea for the eastern part of Ukraine heavily rely on this gateway, now that under Russian control. And so I think with the situation developed around the Kerch Strait, the dangers of separationists of eastern part is increasing rather than decreasing.
Let's look at the position and entity of the two provinces in eastern Ukraine. Look at what happened between Georgia and Russia under the leadership of Saakashvili. South Ossetia and Abkhazia became independent. Of course, China has not recognized the sovereignty and independence of these two little republics, quote unquote. So, do you think eastern Ukraine, particularly these two provinces, could be compared in parallel to these young independent states under the umbrella of Russia?
Well, there's a history here because the reason that those two provinces are populated by Russians was that Stalin put Russians there to make sure that Ukraine was more compliant. At the time, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. But to go directly to your question, I think it's possible. But the other question is, are you going to have either some kind of forced ethnic cleansing or some kind of a separation or exchange of populations in those areas like the Greeks and the Turks did in the aftermath of World War I?
Yes,
I'm not sure.
Yes, well, let me go back to Pavel. Pavel, we were talking about the implications of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which used to be two provinces or autonomous regions of Georgia. Now they have become independent, quote unquote. So what do you think of the future of these two eastern regions in Ukraine? I mean, the two regions in eastern Ukraine, are they likely to follow the example of Abkhazia and South Ossetia?
Well, de facto, of course, they are kind of Russian protectorates. And they are reliable extremely in their existence on Russian support of different kind, including military support. But Russia is obviously reluctant to recognize them as breakaway independent states, or maybe as they wanted wanted some of the people living there.
Are you suggesting that the Russians
right
are afraid of further
Russia
economic sanctions as a result of recognizing the independence of these two provinces?
Well, there has been talk about that in some circles in Moscow, which are not kind of so much government, more kind of close to government, more nationalistic circles, of such a possibility, or a possibility of Russia kind of reunification like with Crimea. But I believe the Kremlin is very reluctant to do that, because the Kremlin doesn't need those two small pieces of Ukraine. The Kremlin wants to turn around the entirety of the Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Pavel. We are going to
conclude
conclude.
To return to the fold. So that means they don't. Yeah, they don't want these small pieces of Ukraine. They want all of it.
All of it.
They want all of Ukraine to be pro-Russian.
We understand.
And for that, you don't need to kind of take away those pieces, because that means that there will be less pro-Russian people inside the Ukraine, because Moscow wants all of Ukraine to be a pro-Russian state, like, you know, Belarus.
We understand the appetite of Moscow for
not to be a
Ukraine.
pro-Western.
Thank you so much. Xi, very quickly, before we conclude this interesting discussion, the reason why Washington keeps a distance from Kiev on this particular issue is that they have taken China as the major threat to the so-called national security of the United States, and therefore it doesn't want to be involved in the dilemma in Eastern Europe.
Well, I think theoretically, U.S. strategically focus on China, but Russian issue, Russian challenges is more urgent than China challenge. So now U.S. in a dilemma. So put Russia or China, which one is at the top priority? So that's the dilemma facing U.S. You cannot say because of China, U.S. has to ignore Russia's challenge, or because of Russia, ignore China's challenge.
Well, that's of course an issue of a to be or not to be, a question to be answered by Hamlet. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.